Hello everybody, today I'm going to talk about the dark and scary and violent carpentry tools Iceberg. As you go down the list, you see that carpentry tools aren't something that safe. If you think you know something about carpentry, you are wrong. You know the deep secret behind carpentry tools and the dark aura they possess. That's ridiculous. What am I doing? What am I doing? What's that? What was that? Hello everybody, my name is Peter the Blue, also known as guy talking in front of a camera about an iceberg number 1357. And today I'm going to present to you the fictional universe's iceberg. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking about how good your dinner is, but you should also be thinking about how interesting this iceberg might be. Oh, but everybody's doing icebergs. That's such a cliche. Why don't you do something original? Listen here, you little fella. Just because the genre of this video isn't creative, I assure you, this video is very interesting. Fictional universes are something very well known, and I'm actually very surprised that I never seen an iceberg about this content before. There is a variety of fictional universes out there. Of course, technically every piece of fiction can be a fictional universe, but today I'm going to talk about the interesting ones. The sci-fis, the fantasies, cyberpunks, dystopias, and the really weird stuff that you're going to see in the next episodes, like geometry lands, microscopic worlds, dream scenarios. There is a whole universe of universes that is in need to be explored. But for this first level, I'm going to focus on the most famous fictional universes. And because most of you will know what I'm talking about when I talk about the universes in this level, I'm not going to go too deep in the description, especially because I want to give a little bit more of a room for me to talk about what I think is interesting about those worlds and what are my reflections on what those worlds mean and why they get so famous. So without further ado, I'm not apologizing about my accent. Let's talk about the fictional universe's iceberg. So why don't we start with the granddaddy of modern world building creation, Middle-earth. Middle-earth was created by Tolkien in 1939. Now, this is not really a mythology video. That's why I don't really want to talk about the Greek or Egyptian or Norse mythology. But a lot of the worlds I'll talk about do have a lot of inspirations that come from those mythologies. Middle-earth, for example, comes from Midgard. Midgard is how the Vikings or the Norse people they would call our universe, because in their belief the entire world is connected to a tree, and this tree has a lot of branches, and you have the bottom of the tree, which is Helheim, and the top, which is Valhalla. In the middle, it's Midgard. Middle-earth also has other elements of Norse mythology, like the dwarves, the elves, the orcs. So he took a lot of the mythos from those mythologies, but put them together with the concept of medieval Europe, more specifically, medieval Britain. Now, the world of Tolkien is really interesting because it was created as an afterthought. You see, Tolkien was a linguistic, and he always had this dream of creating this language that would evolve and develop as time goes on. That's why he created Elvish. He wanted to give context, because he knows language isn't like an static thing. Language develops, language grows. And after that, well, you know the story. But what Tolkien did at that time became a basis for how people would world build after that, how people would create fictional fantasy universes and sci-fi universes and other types of universes. He created this idea of contextualizing everything, and that's why he's the granddad of modern world building, because he popularized it. There were world builders before, but after Tolkien, everything changed. In more or less the same time in which Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, another great writer and one that would influence generations to come was also creating a fictional universe. His name was C.S. Lewis, and he made the next entry on the list, Narnia. Narnia is the story of 4 orphans who evacuate from London during World War II. In the first book, these orphans are teleported via wardrobe, of all things, to a land with magical creatures and castles and witches and talking animals called Narnia. Now, Narnia is quite different from Middle-earth. While Tolkien took a lot of inspirations from Norse mythology, C.S. Lewis' biggest influences came from the Bible. The idea of Narnia seems a lot like the idea of the Garden of Eden. I mean, that makes sense. And part of the first book kind of resembles a war between the good God and the devil. I mean, you have animals that talk, trees that take the forms of humans, you have fauns, you have centaurs. It has that whole spring vibe, and you have the ice switch that has this idea of winter and destruction. And in the end, the orphans win, but then you have the next books in which you see the earth changing as the humans from Narnia evolve. It's kind of this mirror to our reality in the canonic Bible history, in which the first sin is like a separation between man and nature, and this kind of seems to happen between the first book, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the next book, the Prince Caspian. Narnia isn't really as influential as Middle-earth, but is nonetheless one of the most influential pieces of fantasy ever written. The Wizarding World of Harry Potter is the place in which the Harry Potter books takes place. So for those who don't know, Harry Potter is this story about a young orphan boy who receives a letter to go to Hogwarts, which is the school of magic. In there, he will learn about spellcasting, potion making or potion crafting, defense against the dark arts. Now, the world of Harry Potter, it's a bit different from Middle-earth and Narnia because, well, the world of Harry Potter kind of came after the story. J.K. Rowling created this amazing concept of a school in which you go and you can cast magic and fight creatures and use spells, and it was just so captivating and people loved it. And each book that passed, you would see Harry grow up year by year. J.K. Rowling didn't really want to create a really hard world because she always put the creativity in the first place. If she made these rules, for example, oh, you can only cast a spell if you have certain things in your mind. Well, if you don't make a rule, then you don't have nothing to explain, and it's just fun. And that really helps because when she does want to create some rule, like time travel, she kinda screws everything up. Now, considering the 3 fantasy worlds we talked about, in an order of how whimsical they are, I would say at the bottom, the least whimsical would be Middle-earth. At the middle would be Narnia because you have talking beavers and Santa Claus. But at the top, at the most whimsical, would be J.K. Rowling. You have some of the most whimsical stuff in here. You have this game called Quidditch in which you play with flying broomsticks, ghosts that fly around and make pranks on people. You have candies that when you eat, it creates different effects. Elves that represent Jewish people. You have transphobia. Seriously, why is this woman not in jail? What the fuck? You see that world that began when Harry was about 11 years of age evolve and become less and less whimsical. You will start seeing stuff like the Ministry of Magic, the Mentors, and Azkaban, and you'll say, oh, maybe this is darker. Because the whole idea was to make the world evolve with Harry. This is known as soft world building because you don't really have this set of rules, and technically, if you see the timeline of Harry Potter, you'll notice that everything that happens in the timeline Harry Potter knows about. There is nothing that happened that never came to the attention of Harry, because everything surrounds Harry. It's not really the best, but it's really important nonetheless. Just don't search for schools of the world of Harry Potter. I mean, she literally put Ukraine and Russia together. What? The DC shared universe might be, if not the first, the second largest fictional universe ever created. You have Superman, you have Batman, you have Wonder Woman, but you also have the entire Greek pantheon, the entire Norse pantheon, Constantine, Sandman, the Watchmen. All of those characters actually do belong in the DC shared universe, because every comic released by DC is part of the DC shared universe. It's not one universe, it's a multiverse. That's why you can have Batman being this super realistic street fighter, and in other places you'll see Batman fighting this intra-dimensional creature that can copy their minds into a hive mind, and it's bonkers because all of those realities can exist as long as they belong to DC. I think the most interesting aspect of the DC multiverse is that despite that, they sort of have this myth of creation. I mean, you have this thing called the Presence, which is basically God in the DC shared universe, and this Presence didn't really create the universe. He created the creature that created the universe. Volthom, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's sort of this creature that is made of complete light, and he uses the White Lantern. Yeah, so you have the Green Lantern, you have the Red Lantern, you have the creator of the universe, which is a White Lantern. He basically created light, and then he created Earth. You have like this sort of Genesis, but with extra steps. It's kind of strange, and it's kind of weird that they made God a lantern user. Most of these superhero universes work like this. It's like a mixture of a lot of stuff, of fantasy, sci-fi, and realism. And as we'll see, we'll have a lot of superhero universes that will come along in the list. Remember when I said that DC might not be the largest fictional universe? It might be the second. Well, that spot can belong to Marvel. Marvel's shared universe, much like DC's shared universe, was created to give some sort of continuity to the Marvel's comic characters. It might be more complex than DC, but I mean, at this point they're so big it doesn't really matter. Marvel has a very different view on how to portray fictional universes. While on DC you have this idea of being serious most of the time. Of course there are exceptions. Marvel doesn't really care about that. They want to make wizards fight robots and aliens and dinosaurs, all because they want to appeal to a wider audience. They love crossovers, they love battles, they love all that stuff. Of course, DC does love that too, but I mean, in Marvel, nothing is really too serious most of the time. When they try to be serious, it works quite well, but they really just want to have fun. You can feel that a lot in the MCU in the past years, but with the success of the MCU, the comics also began to use this approach, or making more funny, comedic, more pop stuff. And it works. The thing is, those universes are so huge, you should expect to have a lot of variety in it. Of course, this universe was not made by an author. The universe changed so much and it grew so much that this is basically authorless world. You have many faces, many minds adding to it. And that can work and that cannot. But that's kind of the beauty of it, you know, it's kind of chaos. And in chaos, you have a lot of bizarre nonsense stuff. but you can have a lot of great stuff in it. I'm putting a pillow under the chair so I can look taller in the camera. I mean, I am tall, but Continue with this idea of fictional worlds created by companies, we have Warhammer. What the? Wrong song! Wrong song! Now, when I talk about Warhammer, you have two fictional universes that used to be interlinked but aren't really anymore. You have the Mortal Realms, which are the fantasy part of Warhammer, and Warhammer 40k, which is the sci-fi version. Warhammer, the bulk of the series, is a tabletop game in which both players have to command different armies in order to complete an objective. It's quite different from other tabletop games because each piece you control is actually a miniature piece that you kind of have to construct yourself. You have small pieces, like for example the Ultramarines, which are the soldiers of Warhammer 40k, the most famous group of soldiers, the most famous army of the universe. And for each Ultramarine in your army, you have to have a real Ultramarine in the table. And honestly, the lore part is what I enjoy the most. I mean, I don't really care about the gameplay aspect or the craftsman aspect. I just don't really have time or interest. That's actually a lie. Just don't have money. I mean, $1,000 an army. $1,000. What do you think I am? Bill Gates? Now, some fictional worlds don't really have names. I mean, the world in which Warhammer 40k takes place is just called the Galaxy. Sometimes I'll have to talk about the franchise, the name of the franchise, in order to refer to the world in which that universe takes place. So, beginning with Warhammer 40k, which is the most famous franchise in the Warhammer series, there is one quote that perfectly describes that world. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. For those who don't know, 40k means the year in which the whole story takes place. The Warhammer 40k lore is really complex. It's really dense, and a lot of stuff actually happened in those 40k years. During that time, Earth was able to create a mankind empire, lose that empire, which made a lot of the planets get stranded, meaning they couldn't, the citizens of those planets couldn't travel between each, which of course created a lot of problems. The Earth became like this sort of Mad Max apocalyptical place. And on Mars, they began a cult of the machine in which people would replace their human parts with machine parts because they thought flesh was weak. Everything was basically a mess. Until, of course, appeared the God Emperor of mankind. Now, as we've seen from the other universes, those people that are referred to as gods usually are like a metaphor for Jesus Christ or something like that. Well, the God Emperor of mankind is more inspired by someone like Alexander the Great. He was actually viewed as a god because of his great powers and his elevated IQ, but in the lore, he was really against the idea of churches. He had this anthropocentric view of the world. He wanted mankind to succeed, to evolve, to conquer. But people looked at him with so much prowess. They literally followed him as if he was a god, as if he was a messiah. With him, the empire of mankind began to grow again. Now, nothing is perfect, nothing lasts forever. And even though the empire grew for 10,000 years, the biblical metaphors always come back. The God Emperor was betrayed by one of his sons, which are called the Primarchs and are not really his sons. They were just genetically built by him to be also great leaders, etc., etc., etc. One of the Primarchs, which is called Horus, betrayed the God Emperor in what's called the Horus Heresy. This is a very important part of the Warhammer 40k lore. After that, the God Emperor was defeated. So what did humanity do? Well, what any sane person would do. Humanity put his half-alive skeleton in a throne and fed him souls for the rest of his life. So this is where the universe is now. You have a half-alive God that probably wants to die, standing on a throne. He can't really speak, he can't really do much, but people are just keeping him alive, so maybe they have something to worship. Maybe that's what humanity needs. Someone, even if it doesn't exist, for them to believe in. Now, I don't really want to talk too much about Age of Sigmar, that is the fantasy version of Warhammer, because it's really similar to Warhammer in many ways. It has gods and weird creatures and elves and orcs. In many ways, that's one of the most interesting aspects of Age of Sigmar and Warhammer 40k. They are so similar, despite being one being sci-fi, another being fantasy. Each one takes elements from each other. You have the Warhammer 40k orcs and elves. You have different planes of existence in Warhammer Age of Sigmar that have this alien-like bug, insect-like creatures, each one exchanging elements from one another. And it's really interesting how those two universes communicate with each other, even though they're very different from each other. Lovecraft. The Lovecraft Country is the place in which many of the stories and tales written by H.P. Lovecraft are set. It's in that region in which Lovecraft decides to put his fictional towns and cities for the stories he wants to tell. But the Lovecraft universe actually expands way beyond that small American region. Now, that man actually created an entire mythology of dimensions, places, gods, way beyond our human understanding. Now, a lot of people know about Lovecraft and his influences in horror stories. A lot of people, when they are really afraid of something, they call it Lovecraftian. But what is Lovecraftian? Well, what it means to be Lovecraftian is actually what I think it's the most unique part of the Lovecraftian universe. Now, Lovecraftian, for me, it's that idea of primal horrors being evoked. That sentiment you have when you are a kid and you are lying down in bed and you see a shadow of a branch or the wind moving the curtains, but you can't really see that well because it's dark and you don't really know what's out there, and that frightens you. And that not knowing, sometimes it's scarier than what's actually there. Technically speaking, it's a universe we cannot explain. We cannot really talk about the Lovecraftian universe because it's beyond what we can conceive. Of course, when he writes about it, he's talking to us in ways that we can understand. So when he talks about Cthulhu and he describes Cthulhu, he's talking about a creature that is scary, but we can understand. But Cthulhu actually is much greater than that. Now, Cthulhu isn't really just a giant octopus guy with small wings. Of course not. He is an ancient god. And just looking at him and just being near him makes us crazy. And Lovecraft loves doing that with tales like The Caller from Outer Space, in which he explains things that cannot really be explained. Now, it's really impressive that a guy can make a universe in such a way, because today we want more and more. I've seen worlds that describe the photosynthetic process of how plants absorb the light of a red sun. And like, well, that's impressive, but you don't really need that to do amazing things. The known world of Game of Thrones is the universe in which the Chronicles of Ice and Fire takes place. It was created by George R.R. Martin, and it's very famous today by the TV series made by HBO, Game of Thrones. which is the name of the first book of the series. This world consists of 3 continents: Sotorios, Essos, and the most important one, Westeros. Now, the world of Game of Thrones is really unique because, different from other famous works of fiction, this world is much more focused on realism. Now, when I say that, of course, you might get a bit confused. How is this world realistic? I mean, you have zombies, you have dragons, you have giants, huge wolves, you have witches, you have curses, you have an enormous wall that begins in one side of the continent and ends in the other side of the continent. Now, the interesting part is that in George R.R. Martin's universe, those things are not the focus. I mean, when I say Tolkien took a lot of inspiration from medieval Europe, that isn't really correct. He took the idea of medieval Europe, the cool stuff of medieval Europe. He took the kings, the princes, wars, the soldiers, the heroes. And while he did that, George here took inspiration from actual medieval Europe. That means the political intrigue, the inequality, the injustice, how easy people can die. The heights of the story are the political power intrigues, the conversations, the trials, the human connections. Now, this type of plot continues to the lore of the world. In the real world, in medieval times, the kingdoms had this feudal system. Now you had your kingdom, which is this large landmass, and this kingdom has a king that is in power, but inside the kingdom there were smaller lands controlled by houses. In Westeros, it kind of works the same way. The regions are divided into various houses. So you have the House Stark that controls the north, you have the Lannisters, the Baratheons. Now all those houses fight for power, for independence, for control, much like in the real world. But of course, Martin introduces some fantasy spices to those real elements. Like in the past, kings wanted to unify and conquer a large piece of land in order to become kings. They would use large armies, technologies, political strategies, etc. While in Westeros, the king that conquered all in the past and unified all those houses, well, he used the dragon. Now, one last fun fact, as you can see here, the land of Westeros, it's just basically the British Islands conjoined together and put upside down. Star Trek is a 1966 TV series created by Gene Roddenberry, in which we, the spectators, follow a ship called the USS Enterprise in a 5-year mission to explore space. Now, the original Star Trek was really important. It was a landmark in geek culture. It brought that idea of science and discovery and exploration, but not in a boring sense. Before Star Trek, sci-fi was mostly seen as almost like a subgenre of horror. You had things like the War of the Worlds, a series like The Twilight Zone that bring up our worst nightmares. Now, if you think about it, Mary Shelley, who arguably is the first sci-fi author, created Frankenstein as a cautionary tale to say that science can go too far and we really shouldn't try to play with God's creation. And then Star Trek came, and it showed how science can be wonderful, can bring the best of humanity, can make us discover and explore more and more and go beyond the limit.
Esa vaina, profesor. Yo sabía que usted tenía un plan. ¡Que viva el profe! ¡Que viva la ciencia, carajo!
Tenga.
Is that the Colombian version of Breaking Bad? Who's editing this? Now, talking about the universe itself, Star Trek doesn't really have that much of a consistency, but mostly of that is due to the format of the series. You see, the world was conceptualized to be in episodic format. What that means is that every week when a new episode arrives on television, it would have an entire arc happening with beginning, middle, and end, and in the next episode, a new arc would happen, and after that, a new arc, which means that characters from one episode won't necessarily appear in the next episodes because they served their purpose. Because of that, the original series doesn't have that much world building depth. With the movies that follow and with the series that follow, like Star Trek Next Generation, we see more and more consistency with the world. We learn about the Vulcans, which is the Spock's race. We will learn about androids. We will learn about Klingons, who, by the way, have an entire language, a developed language. And there are many real-life plays, for example, Macbeth, that were rewritten in Klingon. The Dune universe was first conceptualized by Frank Herbert in 1963. He went on to write 6 books about it, and after his death, his son Brian Herbert decided to continue his father's work by writing more and more works of fiction set in this universe. Now, before I continue talking about the universe itself, again, Dune is one of those universes that don't really have a name. It's just our galaxy but set in the future. But here's the thing. I have to talk about how Dune was actually conceived. You see, before Dune became this extremely influential work of sci-fi that we know today, Frank Herbert actually published short stories about the setting of Dune in a magazine called Analog magazine. So Analog is kind of this birthplace of many of the most famous and influential sci-fi works ever put to paper. At the time, there wasn't really that much appeal for sci-fi, but once Alagor came in the 1930s, it actually changed the game a bit. Authors could send their short stories to the magazine and actually get published, and people could read it, and if the public found those stories interesting, well, then it might get a serialization. So in the case of Frank Herbert, he actually began his author career sending his works to Analog magazine. People would read those stories and really enjoy, and so Frank decided to continue writing about it. As you'll see in the next few entries, maybe not on this level, but in the ones after, if a sci-fi universe wasn't published in Analog, it was influenced by a work that was published in Analog. Well, let me just talk a bit about the Dune universe and see if you can understand where I'm coming from. So the Dune universe takes place thousands and thousands of years into the future. The humans were able to conquer the entire galaxy, or at least most of it, and create this vast galactic empire. The titular name Dune is actually the nickname of the planet Arrakis, which is the setting of the first few books of the series. Now, before I talk about Arrakis, I need to talk to you a bit about how politics work in this intergalactic empire. Now, the galaxy of Dune is actually separated into various regions, and all of those regions are actually controlled by a man called the Emperor of Mankind. But of course, the Emperor cannot exert his power onto every region, so what he did was give each region to what would be equivalent of medieval houses. Now, just because those houses followed the orders of the Empire, that didn't really mean that they had to be peaceful with each other. So what we'll see in the Dune universe is a lot of political conflicts between those houses. Usually in this sort of feudal system, the most powerful house is the one that has the largest amount of land, or in this case, the largest amount of planets under it. But in the case of Dune, there is an exception. Arrakis is so important that whomever controls Arrakis controls the entire empire. Arrakis is this desolate planet in the middle of nowhere that has 90% of its surface covered with sand, and the only living creature in that planet are gigantic sheep-eating vermins. Now, you might wonder, why such a desolate, lifeless world would be so important? Well, because in the sense of Dune, there is a special material called the spice melange. This substance is so important that without it, there would be absolutely no empire whatsoever. By using the spice, humans can actually transcend their mental capabilities. A human that inhales spice for long periods of time can actually make calculations as powerful as supercomputers. Some humans actually choose to submerge themselves in spice, and that elevates their psychic capabilities so much that they can open portals, allowing ships to travel between solar systems. It's because of that the spice is so important. Without it, intersolar travel would be basically impossible in this universe. A few people don't really need the spice to have psychic powers. You have this like secret society called the Bene Gesserit that is composed only of women, and they are super influential and super shady, and they have this thing called the voice that can control people's movements and thoughts and ideas at will. Now this is interesting because the first protagonist of the Dune series, Paul Atreides from the House Atreides, is actually one of the first males in many generations that is capable of using the voice. And this is really important for the plot, and I really don't want to explain that because I really want you to read the books, because those are some of the best works of sci-fi ever made. Now guys, I'm gonna be honest, this next one hits right here. It's one of those places in fictional universes that reminds me of that aspect of world building that is the childhood wonder, you know, that innocence, feeling, that desire of creating something beautiful and something that gives hope and love. 1984 is a novel written by George Orwell and depicts a world in which people can barely have their own thoughts without feeling like they're being watched and that they will be punished by it. Being the first and probably most influential dystopian entry in the list, the world that Orwell created is the world that none of us want to be a part of. The entire novel actually takes place in a region called Airship One. Airship One is a province allegedly localized in the country of Oceania. Oceania being one of the 3 countries that survived the unification of the world. The other 2 being East Asia and Eurasia. Now we don't really know a lot about East Asia or Eurasia, but we know a lot about Oceania, being this extremely totalitarian country controlled by this figure called the Big Brother.
Ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory thoughts. Our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause.
Oceania is said to be the country that controls Australia, all of the Americas, and of course what used to be Great Britain. Now, as far as we know, the Big Brother is this really influential figure, and he has power over all the parties in 1984. You have the inner party, which is the police, and the police in this world controls everything. They control and suppress everyone. They keep everything in check. They make sure everyone is serving Big Brother in the right way, you know. Then you have the outer party, which in this fictional world are the aristocrats, who hold all the power to themselves. They hold all the knowledge to themselves because they have power, they have influence, they have money. And this is really interesting. You have the third party, which are the proletarians, who are party only in name. They don't really do much, and they are, most of the time in the book, they are stepped on and they are being controlled by the other parties. It's so interesting that the mind can't think of this totally fictional, totally different worlds from our own, you know. It's quite interesting how imagination can go, you know. Now, to me, what I think is the most interesting part of 1984, mostly in its world building aspect, is the fact that everything I just told you might be a lie. I mean, not everything, there is a totalitarian regime, but everything I told you about Eurasia, Oceania, East Asia, even the year in which the book takes place, allegedly is 1984, but everything, all of those informations, well, they come from the party itself. We don't really know what's happening out there. No one really knows. As far as we are concerned, this doesn't exist. George Orwell managed to make a world that it's kind of in a superposition. It might exist, it might not exist. It doesn't really matter if those countries are real and Oceania is at war with Eurasia and East Asia. Then, well, too bad, there is nowhere to go. If it's false, well, the citizens will never know, and that's the scariest part of this novel. And that's why I think it's so unique and so great. Now, if you play D&D, you might be wondering, how exactly does this work? I mean, the whole catch of the game is that you are only limited by your imagination. You can create any world you want. Why do we need a D&D lore? Why does that exist? Now, there are two reasons for that. The first is that, well, not everybody wants to world build. A lot of people just want to be presented with a vast array of tools and just work a story out of it. The second reason is, of course, marketing. You can't really sell a game based on imagination. I mean, what you say, like, woo, in this game you can have a father that loves you, woo! No, of course not. You have to sell something tangible. And in order to sell an RPG fantasy setting, you have to create an RPG fantasy world. As I said before, when talking about Warhammer, worlds that come from games, be tabletop games or video games, they tend to appeal a lot to diversity. The universe was created to be sort of this crossover between many fantasy mythologies and folklores and legends. In this universe, you have your same old orcs and elves and dwarves and yada yada yada, but you also have other creatures from around the world, like Sphinx, manticores, and even aliens to some extent, or at least the Forgotten Realms version of the aliens. As the game went from the 3rd edition to the 5th edition, they wanted to include more and more of this diversity. That's why they included characters like the monk, the entire plane system that includes gods from Norse, Egyptian, and Greek mythologies. The plane system, by the way, which I think is the most interesting aspect of this world, it's like these vastly different levels of afterlife that you can access depending of your alignment. You can go to like 17 different types of realms, vast mountains, fire pits, steampunk warriors. I don't really get that one. What does that have to do with the afterlife? Why are robots in the afterlife? Why? One Piece! The Grand Line is the main setting of the manga created by Eiichiro Oda in 1999 called The One Piece. I'm gonna be honest, I really love this one. Like, seriously, this one is my jam. I'm addicted to it. I need help. To understand the lore of the One Piece world, you kind of have to understand its geography, because one thing correlates to the other. Now, the One Piece planet is divided into 7 sections. You have these 4 corners, which are these vast oceans, each one being called a blue. So we have the North Blue, the South Blue, the East Blue, and the West Blue. Most of the population lives in those 4 corners, but the most interesting stuff happens right here in between those 2 white lines. That is the Grand Line. Now, you can divide the Grand Line into 2 sections, the New World and Paradise. Paradise being the first half, and is the only half in which people from the South Blue, North Blue, East Blue, and West Blue can enter. You cannot do the reverse. You cannot enter from the South Blue to the New World. In its most fundamental form, the One Piece world is a world of pirates and marines, chaos and order. I think the greatest part about the One Piece world is that it lies to you. And this comes from a fan, okay? This anime lied to me. I thought I was gonna have fun. I didn't have fun. I had the pressure. The entirety of One Piece can be described as bonkers 1984. When you start watching, you might think you'll have a fun time, have a few laughs, and maybe turn off your brain to just let some time pass. But as you go along with the manga and with the anime, you see that this is a really complex world. Now, besides Marines and pirates, of course, you have more stuff, you have more aspects, like a revolutionary army. You have the fishmen, who, of course, if you have a world that is 90% water, probably some sapient creatures might evolve inside the water, so that's why the concept of fishmen came. But you also have giants and this creature called the Tontatas and the Skypians. But besides that concept of order and chaos, what I think is my favorite part of the world is the fact that most often than not, it feels like the author, Eiichiro Oda, had everything in mind ever since chapter 1. At the point of I'm writing this video and recording it, we know barely nothing about the One Piece world. We know there is like an entire 100 years of history of the world completely gone, and we don't know where it is. But we, fans of One Piece, have faith that Eiichiro Oda knows. Wonderland is a fictional world created by Lewis Carroll in 1865 and is the setting of both books, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. Now, many of you might have been astonished by the age of those books. I mean, they are like more than 150 years old now. Many of you might have known Alice from the animated Walt Disney films or the Tim Burton modern takes. Of course, those are factors for which perceive the books to be much younger. However, if you think about it, the Carroll style is in many ways really modern. He's kind of the creator of this idea of absurdist world building. The land of Wonderland doesn't really make sense. It's not coherent, it's not conjoined. I'm pretty sure it doesn't follow the laws of physics. Nevertheless, we can see some consistencies in it. When he conceptualized Wonderland, he never thought about it as a coherent place. It was quite literally a land of dreams. If you think about it, in many ways, the world building in Alice in Wonderland is kind of paradoxical. In one way, in order to world build, you have to keep some consistency. That's how a world works. It has to be something to grasp onto, because if not, nothing makes sense. Plot holes begin to appear. However, in Wonderland, the whole rule of the world is there are no rules. He was going out of his way to make this place incoherent. So maybe in his attempt of making the most incoherent world possible, he actually looped around and make an extremely coherent world. Because the one constant thing about Wonderland is that there is no constant and nothing makes sense. I'm recording for 8 hours now. It's getting really hard, but I'm gonna finish this. Pandora is the fictional planet in which the movie Avatar takes place. It was created by James Cameron in 2009, and more recently, it actually received a new movie in the franchise. So the entire idea of Pandora is a planet that was never touched by technology. A planet in which the citizens of the planet, the so-called Na'vi, are in tune with the rest of the biomes and the creatures of the land. Now I really like the vibe of Pandora. Every creature is bioluminescent. That means they kind of glow in the dark, which gives the whole forest a neon look. The world of Pandora is visually stunning. It was made to be visually stunning. The whole idea of the movie is to push After Effects and visual effects to their limits at the time. Because of that, they created some of the most beautiful settings ever seen in sci-fi. I mean, you have the bioluminescent forests, you have the waterfalls, the sea reefs, the oceans, the floating mountains. Now, in some ways, the world of Pandora is really, really interesting. You have this whole philosophy of connecting with nature. They had this spiritual goddess that lives inside the planet of Pandora. They call it Awa. If I'm not mistaken, I may be pronouncing that incorrectly, like everything else in the video. But in other ways, the world doesn't really make that much sense. Although the fauna is really beautiful indeed, mostly it's just animals that exist or existed on Earth, but with one more set of limbs and glowing skin. Yeah, honestly, I'm not a big fan of Pandora. I think it's pretty weak in world building, but well, it made almost $4 billion at the box office, so people must be seeing something I don't. Narn is the planet that serves as a setting for the entirety of the Elder Scrolls franchise. In the first game of the series, Elder Scrolls Arena, you play in one of the continents of Narn, and this continent is called Tamriel. Now, although there is an entirely new continent by the east of Narn, most of the series, if not all of the series, take place in various regions of Tamriel. One of my favorite aspects of Tamriel are the various different races that encompass the region. In other universes, you do have this geological separation between different races. The dwarves live in the caves, and most of the elves live in the woods, and the humans live in basically everywhere else. However, what I really enjoy about Tamriel is how more or less equally divided everything is, and how the cultures are really different from one another. Bethesda wants to, in each new entry, show us a different region. They showed us Morrowind in the third game of the series. They showed us Cyrodiil in the fourth. They showed us Skyrim in the fifth, and who knows where they will go. Maybe we will go to Elsewhere, which is the land of the Khajiit, the obligatory furry race, which is inspired by nomadic people and Egyptian and Arabic cultures. Or we can go to Black Marsh, the land of the Argonians, inspired by pre-colonial Aztec civilizations, and the entire land looks like a gigantic swamp with lots of poisonous creatures. And I love it when world builders move a step up even beyond that, even beyond the continental. For example, Narn, even though every single story from the Elder Scrolls universe happened on Narn, at least in the games, you also have other 8 planets in the system, and each of them has some bit of lore. It's really great when we can see, especially in fantasy world, that fantasy worlds don't really talk a lot about the planets and solar systems, but I really love when they try to move more and more outwards. It makes you feel like the world is ever expanding and you're just a tiny speck on everything.
We're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz.
The Land of Oz was created in the 1900s by L. Frank Baum, and it's the setting in which the entire Oz series takes place. I don't know how is the Wizard of Oz fandom in the United States. Only put it here because, well, it's really famous, is a mark of cinema. Well, I'm sorry, The Wizard of Oz isn't that big of a thing in my country. I'm sorry, but I didn't know there were 14 different Oz books. What? Now I'm sorry, I really want to talk about this. I really need to talk about this, okay? Because out of all the entries in this first level, the one I thought I would have the least to talk about was Oz. But turns out, no. This Baum guy, the dude had to create an entire geography of the world of Oz, fantasy creatures and political and created an entire economic system. What is this guy high on? The entire land of Oz is divided into 4 countries. That is not counting the Emerald City. All of those countries surround the Emerald City. And the names of those countries are, I'm sorry, I have to read this. Munchkin, Winky, Quadling, and Gillikin. And apparently, not only that, the entirety of the first movie, which is the first book in the series, takes place in the road between Munchkin and the Emerald City. Look at this, okay? This is the land of Oz, correct? Okay, well, makes sense. I mean, he wanted to make some sort of world building, you know, it was the beginning of the 20th century. He wanted to create something new. Well, that's not the Oz universe, okay? That's not it. Surrounding the land of Oz, well, you have this enormous desert that if you touch the sand in the desert, you actually yourself turns into sand. And outside of the desert, you think it's over. No, of course not. You have other countries called the Land of Eve, the Kingdom of Ish, the Lowland Highland, the dominions of the Gnome King. There is actually the map of what could be the entire continent of Oz. And this was created after the death of Frank Baum, okay? This was made by the fan base, the Oz fan base. What's the Oz fan base? You also have various races that live in the land of Oz and the other countries surrounding it. And just to name a few examples, you have the Bun people, who are creatures made of cake. You have the Hammerheads, which is a race of people with no arms, huge necks, and really hard foreheads. And then you have the Chinese people, which, oh my god, which I swear to God, are people made of porcelain. Because I don't know. Of course, the most important of all, the dicks. The Pokemon franchise was created by the Nintendo company in 1995. It started as a pretty tame RPG for a Game Boy, and over time it grew more and more, becoming an anime, a manga, a movie. Over time it actually grew to be the most expensive franchise of all time. Now I can see the appeal, honestly. Even the most whimsical worlds have something dark hidden in it. Be the Wonderland, be the Wizarding World, even be Oz, apparently. All of those worlds seem to have something dark. As in, when you grow up, do you really want to go to Hogwarts? I mean, with all the Dementors and the Death Eaters, do you really want to live in that place? I mean, it seems like it has a lot of prejudice with Half-Bloods and slavery and etc. Do you really want to live there? Now, of course, there is one world that I don't think anyone would complain about living inside of it, and that world is Pokemon. You do have a lot of problems. You have to face some pretty violent Pokemon, and you have the whole Team Rocket stuff with the biological contraband. All that stuff, that bad stuff that happens in the Pokemon world, well, it also happens in our world. But in our world, we don't have Pokemons, you know? The Pocket Monsters are these various creatures that roam the earth They are not really animals. They don't behave like animals, especially because I don't think animals exist in the Pokemon world. So the Pokemon are these super powerful creatures. Each one can have one or two elements associated with it. It's not really just fire and water and ice. No, you have much more. You have dragon, fairy, electric. I think there's 18 in total. And while you, as a human, have the technology to capture those pocket monsters with a Pokeball. And once you capture that monster, well, he basically turns into your friend. And of course, as every good friend, you decide to do fun things with him, like eating and joining fashion competitions and dancing and having fun and fighting to the death. According to Nintendo lore, they actually really enjoy that. They see that as a sport, but instead of like punches and kicks, they throw fireballs. Why did I choose to make this topic my first YouTube video? Hello everybody, this is the second day of recording this video. I'm using the same shirt, but don't worry, it got washed. And I'm taking some monster today, that means I'm full of energy. And let's continue, because I can't handle this anymore. No one is watching. It doesn't matter, I mean, everyone is a Jeff Bezos bot, you know, or a Bill Gates bot. The internet is dead, nothing matters. Let's go! No, not the blue Avatar, although technically he gets blue sometimes. Avatar is an animated TV series aired in Nickelodeon mid-2005, I guess. There are actually two series in the Avatar universe. There's Avatar The Last Airbender and Avatar The Legend of Korra. I said legend all wrong, but I don't care anymore. I'm just taking monster. Not sponsored. Now Avatar was really, really important. Before Avatar, fantasy had almost like this homogeneous look, you know? You have token elements, you have dwarves, elves, orcs, etc. And basically everyone lived in medieval alternate version of Europe. Everyone was just doing the same thing. And Avatar kind of changed the game. Despite being an animated series for a very young audience, Avatar was really influential because it changed the way how we saw magic systems. It had this really hard magic system. I'm not gonna explain what hard magic systems are right now, but just to know, it's a system that follows very strict rules. And in Avatar, the rules are, you have two types of people. The ones who are normal and can do anything but are useful in other ways, but basically are just normal humans, and benders. Benders are people who can naturally manipulate other elements. You have four elements in the Avatar world, which are fire, air, earth, and water. Now this is really important because in the Avatar world, those distinctions are the things that divide each nation of Avatar. To understand that, all you have to do is look at the map. You can see that it's divided into four different colors, and each one is a nation. You have the Fire Nation, the Earth Kingdom, the Water Tribes, and the Air Monks. As you can see, each piece of land represents a bending group. The people from the Earth Kingdom are mostly Earth Benders. The people from the Water Tribes are mostly Water Benders. And they don't tend to mix each other. So the Water Tribes have this culture that revolves around praising the moon and spiritualism. The Fire Nation has this very industrial vibe, and the way the creators represented this in this world is really interesting. Instead of taking inspiration from medieval cliche stuff, they took inspiration from other, mostly Eastern cultures. So for example, the Air Monks are inspired by Nepal monks. China was a big inspiration to the Earth Kingdom. Japan was a big inspiration to the Fire Nation, and the Inuit tribes from North Alaska and North Canada were a very big inspiration to the Water tribes. And I really like when they try to diverse. You know, that's something that is really modern and something we didn't really saw before, like around the 1970s, where that started to begin with games like D&D and etc. But in the 2000s, that's when we start to see true diversity, and that's really important. That's really cool. Cyberpunk 2077 is an RPG system from 1988 and is the first cyberpunk world in our list. The cyberpunk aesthetic is this sort of subgenre of science fiction in which technology and capitalism have evolved into extreme levels in the future, while crime and poverty and inequality had gotten worse and worse. Basically, it takes everything that's wrong with our society today and extrapolates into this super technological alternate universe. And instead of normal outdoors we see on the streets, we have these gigantic holographic football field size advertisements. And differently from 1984, in which the world is controlled by the state, in a cyberpunk setting, the world is controlled by corporations. In 2017, more specifically, there are 4 major corporations, which are Arasaka, Militech, Maxtech, and Kenglao. You have some countries like the Soviet Union, the United States, the Japanese Empire. However, the true rulers are the corporations. And while the elites are having the time of their lives, the others are trying to survive on the streets. It's very similar to what happened today if today had very futuristic technologies. So instead of people getting high on methamphetamine, they get high on cybernetic universes. Instead of people buying guns, they buy cybernetic attachments that transform their arms into guns. Cyberware is something that's really important in the 2077 universe, more so than other sci-fi universes. They really want to focus on that because in many ways you can even get addicted to gaining cyberware. And of course, who wouldn't? I mean, you can attach blades to your arms, you can change your eyeball to a cybernetic eyeball that can zoom in like a 40K camera. And it's a really interesting concept, seeing that in many ways our world is evolving incredibly in a technological manner, but in other manners, well, it's kind of doing the opposite. Runeterra is the planet in which the lore of the League of Legends video game takes place. Much like many other fantasy video game worlds from the modern era, the world of Runeterra is pretty diverse. The basic gist of the game is that you have these various wildly different characters fighting in this place called the Summoner's Rift, battling against each other to conquer a tower at the end of the rift. The world of Runeterra is actually really deep and really consistent. It's actually one of the best examples of world building in video games I've seen so far. You have various different regions that are really different from each other, both in geographical influence and in technological aspects. You have the Kingdom of Demacia, in which good and honor are the most important thing. You have the ever-expanding Empire of Noxus, in which strength is the most important aspect of your life. You have the 2 cities, Piltover and Zod. If you saw the Netflix series Arcane, you might be familiar with those two. Piltover being this futuristic steampunk world that has a magic-based technology, and Zon being the city underground from Piltover and has this magic version of a cyberpunk city. Much like D&D, you have various realms. You have the material realm and the spiritual realm, although those two work a bit differently because they are kind of together. They aren't separated in any physical way. But you also have the celestial realm, in which the gods of the universe live. In the description I left a link to the site of the League of Legends. They actually have a pretty detailed roadmap that you can click on the various regions and understand and learn a bit more about each of them. So if you want to know more about the world of Runeterra, just check it out. It's really well done. The continent is the setting on which the fantasy series from
Andrzej Sapkowski
takes place. It is the land of the Witchers. Out of all the universes that I have talked about up until now, the world of the Witcher is the most heavily influenced by the works of Tolkien. Dwarves, elves, gnomes. I mean, do I even have to list the races one more time? You know by now what the races are. Now, it's not a copy. If it was a copy, it wouldn't have made the success it did, transforming the books into a TV show and a video game series that is so loved by many. Although on the surface it is really similar to the world of Tolkien, as you understand more about the lore and about this world, you understand that it's much more developed than that, and it's much more unique. I think the Witcher universe is sort of a middle ground between Tolkien and George R.R. Martin. On one hand, the human relationships and the political games are very realistic and reminiscent of real medieval era interactions, but on the other hand, you have very fantastical creatures that are inspired by real folklore from various countries of the European continent. But the interesting part is that the way
Andrzej,
build the lore actually makes this make sense. The author created this universe to be some sort of fantasy crossover. So the humans from this universe are actually real humans that came into this world via something called the conjunction of spheres. This conjunction is a phenomenon that happens every 1,000 or so years, and what it does is that it meshes various universes together. The consequence of that is that monsters from various dimensions can actually fall into one place. This happened in the continent, in which after the conjunction, creatures like werewolves, mermaids, drakes began to appear. And of course, the most powerful monster that appeared in the continent were the humans. And one of the symbols of how far humans will go in order to get power and become stronger is the Witchers. Witchers are genetically modified humans that were created and trained their whole lives with one mission: kill monsters. It seems a lot of sci-fi, and that's because it kind of is. The only difference is that instead of filling their bodies with nanomachines, well, they put potions in it. The Witchers are like the super soldiers that are responsible for killing monsters. Being as powerful as the monsters makes humans, normal humans, afraid of them. So they kind of become the thing they're trying to kill. They become monsters. It's a tragedy, especially for the protagonist of the series, Geralt, because the people that he is defending are as much afraid of him as they are from the creatures he is fighting against. Transformers is a toy line and media franchise created by Hasbro in 1984. The main setting of the lore is a planet called Cybertron. The Transformers are a robot-like alien race that have the ability of transforming their bodies into other machines, predominantly vehicles. This is the first toy lore on the list if you don't count tabletop games such as Warhammer and D&D as toys. And much like every franchise in which the lore in the world came as an afterthought, the Transformers lore changed quite a bit as the years went on. There is only one constant in the Transformers lore, and it's the war between the Decepticons and the Autobots. The Autobots being the good guys and the Decepticons being the bad guys. And they are fighting for control over Cybertron. You've seen that I use quotes to describe the Decepticons and the Autobots, and that's because as the Transformers lore evolved, those definitions became more and more gray. I could talk a bit about each iteration of the lore, but I don't think that's very effective. Instead, I want to talk about my favorite iteration and the one that's more widely regarded. This is the one that was used in the movies and is the one that most people know about. It's called the Aligned Continuity. In this continuity, Cybertron has this caste-based society in which Transformers that can change into superior machines have a better place in social hierarchy, while other Transformers that transform into machines that aren't really useful go down in the hierarchy. That means a Transformers that can turn into a hyperjet or a spaceship have a better chance on climbing up in the social ladder than Transformers that can change into a garbage truck, for example. In this continuity, the character of Megatron hated this system and wanted to make a revolution to change everything about society. Another character called Orion Pax saw the works of Megatron and joined him in his mission to take down the caste system. However, Orion didn't really like the violent approach of Megatron and thought that he could change the society with words and communication. Orion was so good in communication that the Superior Council of Cybertron actually decided to change his rank to a Prime, and with that, he changed his name to Optimus Prime. With thousands of Transformers by his side, Megatron created the Decepticons, and with his army, he waged war against the higher castes. On the other side, Optimus Prime created the Autobots, and with their help, he would have to defend Cybertron from the Decepticons. And the war finally started. And as I read all of that, I have a realization that the story of Optimus Prime and Megatron is more or less the story of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King if they were robotic alien creatures. Why is Transformer a social criticism about race war? Why? What? And for the last entry on our list, we have Star Wars. The sci-fi fantasy universe created by George Lucas in 1977 is a world so influential and so revolutionary, and so much people know about it, that is synonymous with phenomenal. People say, oh, is this the next Star Wars? It's a world that recontextualizes cowboys, knights, samurais, wizards, and bounty hunters, all in a sci-fi setting. The stories about Jedis, Siths, princes, kings, emperors, spaceships, and droids moved the hearts of people all across the world. It is by far one of the most influential pieces of fiction ever created, and it changed the concept of sci-fi forever. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you can, please leave a like and hit the bell. And what else do YouTubers ask? Comment and subscribe. Yeah, subscribe. Yeah. That's important. That's quite important. I hope you enjoyed this level of the iceberg. As I said, the most interesting things are yet to come. So please be patient, and I want to see you next time. Stay blue. That's so stupid. That's not gonna be my catchphrase. I'm gonna think about a better catchphrase. Until then, stay blue. That's awful.